You spoke at the November 4th demonstration in Washington called the Free Palestine March. It had a lot of people, several 100,000 people there. What do you remember from that experience?
Well, the first thing I remember is that there was no news coverage of it. So 400,000 people march on DC, one of the largest marches in history. It was nowhere to be found in mainstream media coverage, whereas when the Stand With Israel rally happened, between the 300,000 strong Palestine rally and the 400,000 strong Palestine rally, there was a Stand With Israel rally where congressmen were bussed from Congress to speak at that rally, Democrats and Republicans and high-profile celebrities. And it was, live streamed across multiple places. I mean, I have to say this, the ICJ, if that wasn't the greatest display of media bias in the domain of United States mainstream media, then I don't know what is. They live streamed the Israeli defense on multiple news outlets, defending itself against the case for genocide, and completely omitted the South African presentation of the crimes of Israel the day before. So what I remember first and foremost about the protests is that they were nowhere to be found on mainstream media, which was expected. But what I also remember from the actual day of, and from all of the pro-Palestine rallies, is that I have never seen a more multi-faith, more diverse group of people consistently coming out for Palestine against the genocide in Gaza that I have this time around. And I think that has been the experience all around. There's been a pronounced Jewish presence, Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, other anti-Zionist Jewish groups that are against the genocide, against the occupation, former Israeli soldiers even, that have been showing up at these protests. There's been a pronounced presence from Native American groups, indigenous groups, all across the board, right? Christians, Jews, Muslims. I've never seen more diversity at these rallies than I've seen this time around, which I think is a sign of where things are going. And if you look at the under 35 opinion polls, it's very clear that there's a generational gap here, that the country is moving into a more coherent direction and understanding what has been happening over there. And people from all backgrounds are standing up to it now.
What do you think about the protests on campus against Israel?
Every protest I've been to has had the exact same tenor, has had the exact same messaging, but you always have that idiot or two that shows up with a sign. And no one knows who that idiot is, ironically. Never comes with anybody else. Always shows up somehow in the middle of the protest and puts up a sign that says something completely contrary to the messaging of the protests. And then all the cameras shift towards that guy. I see it every single time, but the overwhelming tenor of all of these protests has been consistent. It's been calling for freedom. It's been calling for liberation. It's been calling for an end to the genocide, a ceasefire, an end to the occupation, an end to the apartheid. I will tell you what many people are not seeing. Columbia University, 2 IDF soldiers, former IDF soldiers, spraying Palestinian protesters with skunk water, which is what the IDF uses on Palestinian protesters and sometimes on worshipers on their way to Masjid al-Aqsa, which has multiple health repercussions. And so I was reading about how one of the students that was sprayed on campus at Columbia, Palestinian student, has showered at this point of us doing this podcast 11 times, cannot get the smell out of her, has suffered all sorts of health issues as a result of being sprayed. Again, people are not seeing the other side here. People are not seeing what we've had to deal with at these protests, right? The open bigotry. And I want you to think about this, by the way. People go and serve in the IDF and then come back to the United States or the United Kingdom, and they're not stigmatized for participating in apartheid policies or participating in a genocide. How am I supposed to feel as a Palestinian knowing that this guy right next to me participated in murdering my relatives in Gaza, right? And has open reign to say what he wants to say or do what he wants to do. And so we haven't seen the other side of that as well. But I'd recommend to anyone that's talking about, pro-Palestine protests to actually go see one. If you go to the protests, you listen to what's being said, and you don't just capture. I mean, you got 400,000 people. Don't just go try to find. You're going to find 4 stupid people at a protest of 400,000 people, right? Because the protest scene is always messy. But I think that this is a sign of the outrage and the anger and the frustration that many students have about being silenced, again, in the media, in academic settings. Professors are losing their jobs. Students are having their faces put on trucks, being doxxed, these shady watch lists that get put out. I'm on a few of them as well, and I just don't care anymore, right? But you got these shady watch lists. People are losing their jobs at law firms. They're losing all of their future opportunities, young Palestinian students, because of something that they tweeted that's being taken out of context 10 years ago, right? When they were 17 years old. It's ridiculous. And so I think that, we have to listen to the overwhelming majority of voices of people that are demonstrating for justice, not demonstrating against anyone, but demonstrating for people. Again, there's a large, pronounced Jewish presence at every single pro-Palestine march. In fact, if you look at the organizations, the groups that have taken over Capitol Hill and train stations, it's been "if not now," not in our name, never again means for anyone, right? It's been Jewish groups, many Jewish anti-occupation groups that have been at the forefront. And I think that that's where we have to pay attention to the beauty of how diverse this movement for Free Palestine has actually been.
So the average sentiment is anti-occupation, not anti-Semitic.
It's incredibly lazy to say that anti-Zionism or that anti-occupation is anti-Semitic. First and foremost, the Palestinians are a Semitic people. That's number one. Number two, look, I'm proud of my community. My community has stood against anti-Semitism in this country. The Muslim community has been at the forefront of condemning anti-Semitism. We have stood in front of synagogues. We have stood with the Jewish community when the Jewish community is attacked. This is about occupation. This is a story of a colonial entity that has driven us out of our homes and has done so in such a way that has forced us to try to be the voice of a people that are being exterminated overseas right now. This is not an anti-Semitic movement. This is a pro-freedom movement.
Do you think the protests ever go too far?
The protest scene is a messy scene. And so again, you're going to have sometimes that odd speaker or people get carried away in their emotions. And yes, sometimes people chant things or do things that are contrary to the protests. It's pretty unfair when you judge the entire protest movement by some of these incidents that have happened at protests, and you don't pay attention to what they're protesting about in the first place, which is a genocide. Right now, everything is secondary to ending a genocide that is ongoing. In the course of this discussion, it's not an exaggeration to say that at least 30, 40 people would have been killed just over the last few hours, because we're averaging 135 to 150 a day. So everything else is secondary to that. This is where we all need to be right now as people of conscience. How do we stop this? Because every single day is deeply costly.